Nobody warns a man with a gun tucked in his waistband that his best friend is trying to kill him. It's bad for your health. But when a tired waitress catches a slipped powder in a late-night diner, her exhausted conscience makes a fatal error. She opens her mouth. She expected a bullet. Instead, the next morning, a $500,000 car idles outside her crumbling apartment building, waiting for her. Some favors cost you your life. Others cost you your soul. Neon light flickered outside the diner window, casting sick green shadows across the scratched Formica tables. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of hour where the only people awake are the ones running from something or the ones getting paid to chase them down. Nima Reyes stood behind the counter, pressing the heel of her hand into her lower back. Her uniform smelled like stale fry oil and cheap bleach. She had been on her feet for 9 hours. The diner, a run-down joint called Frank's on the edge of the industrial district, was dead empty. Just Nima, the hum of the ancient refrigerator unit, and the relentless drumming of sleet against the glass front door. The bell above the door chimed sharp and jarring. Cold air swept into the room, bringing the damp smell of the city street with it. 2 men walked in. Nima didn't need to see the faint bulges beneath their expensive coats to know who they were, or at least what they were. You worked nights long enough in this part of town, you learned to read the subtle language of violence. The first man walked with a quiet, grounded authority. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling out a tailored navy topcoat that probably cost more than Nima made in a year. His dark hair was brushed back damp from the rain, and his face was carved in harsh, unyielding lines. He didn't look around the diner to check the exits. He didn't have to. Men like him assumed they owned whatever room they walked into. The second man was different. Shorter, wired, buzzing with a nervous energy that made Nima instantly tense. He wore a flashy leather jacket over a silk shirt, shaking the rain off like a wet dog. His eyes darted toward the kitchen, toward the bathroom doors, toward the dark corners of the restaurant. They slid into a corner booth. The tall man sat facing the door. The twitchy man sat across from him, drumming his fingers on the table. Nima grabbed a menu and a damp rag, walking over. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat, offering neither a smile nor a scowl. It was safer to be invisible. "Black," the tall man said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. He looked up at her, and Nima felt a strange, cold pressure in her chest. His eyes were completely unreadable. Not cruel, not kind, just assessing. "I'll take a coffee with cream and a plate of fries. Make sure they're fresh." The second man snapped, leaning forward. "Not the stuff sitting under the heat lamp since dinner. Everything is fresh." Nima lied smoothly, wiping down the edge of their table. She turned and walked back to the counter, feeling the heavy silence of the 2 men trailing behind her. She poured the coffees into thick ceramic mugs. As she waited for the fry basket to drop, she watched them in the reflection of the stainless steel pie case. The tall man's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glanced at the screen, and his jaw tightened. He stood up, gesturing to the phone. "I need to take this. Watch the table, Tommy." Tommy nodded, waving a hand dismissively. Yeah, Dom. Go ahead." Dom walked toward the front vestibule, stepping into the small entryway to get better reception, putting a thick glass door between himself and the dining area. Nima turned back to the counter, picking up the 2 mugs. She was about to step out from behind the register when a sudden, jerky movement in the reflection caught her eye. Tommy was looking over his shoulder, checking the vestibule, checking the kitchen window. He didn't look at the waitress. Waitresses were furniture. Nima froze the heavy mugs, warming her palms. She watched in the mirrored surface of the pie case as Tommy reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, folded piece of wax paper. With practiced, hurried precision, he flicked the paper open and tapped a fine white powder into Dom's black coffee. Tommy quickly pocketed the paper, grabbed a spoon, and stirred the dark liquid until the powder dissolved into nothing. He leaned back in his booth, Vasquezing his arms, looking out the window, as if he hadn't just moved a muscle. Nima's breath caught in her throat. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. "Look away," her brain screamed. "It's none of your business. In this city you didn't intervene. You didn't play hero. If a man in a tailored suit was going to get poisoned by his twitchy friend, that was a problem for the coroner, not the minimum wage waitress. Speaking up meant getting involved. Getting involved meant getting noticed, and getting noticed by men who carried guns and slipped poison into drinks was a guaranteed way to end up at the bottom of the river. But as she stared at the dark, steaming surface of the poisoned coffee, a sickening wave of guilt washed over her. She imagined the tall man drinking it. She imagined him clutching his chest, falling onto the dirty linoleum, choking on his own blood, while his friend watched. Nima closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She hated her conscience. It was a useless, expensive thing to have. Dom pushed the vestibule door open and stepped back into the diner. He slipped his phone into his pocket, his face thunderous, and began walking back toward the booth. Nima looked at the mugs in her hands. She looked at Dom. She looked at Tommy, who was smiling now, a thin, nervous stretch of lips. She made her choice. Nima stepped out from behind the counter. She didn't carry the mugs. Instead, she grabbed the full glass carafe of scorching hot drip coffee directly from the burner. She moved quickly, Vasquezing the scuffed floor before Dom could reach the booth. Tommy watched her approach, his smile slipping slightly, as he noticed she didn't have his fries. Dom slid into the booth just as Nima reached the edge of their table. She didn't hesitate. She didn't give herself time to think, because if she thought about it, she would run out the back door and never stop. Nima feigned a stumble. She caught the toe of her worn-out sneaker on the leg of the booth, pitching her weight forward. She slammed her hand down onto the table directly into the poisoned mug of black coffee. The heavy ceramic tipped. It didn't just spill, it launched. The scalding, dark liquid splashed violently across the table, completely coating Tommy's hands and soaking into the lap of his expensive leather jacket and silk shirt. The mug hit the floor and shattered with a sharp, violent crack that echoed through the empty diner. "Son of a bitch!" Tommy roared, shooting up from the booth. He scrambled backward, slapping at his burning clothes. "Are you blind? What is wrong with you, you stupid—" Tommy lunged across the table, grabbing Nima's wrist with a vicious, bruising grip. His fingers dug into her tendons, twisting hard. Nima gasped, pain flaring up her arm, but she forced herself not to pull away. She didn't look at Tommy. She looked straight at Dom. Dom hadn't moved. He hadn't flinched when the coffee spilled. He sat perfectly still, his dark eyes locked on Nima. The air in the diner suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. "Let her go, Tommy," Dom said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't carry an ounce of anger. It was completely flat. "She burned me, Dom. Look at this shirt." Tommy snarled, keeping his grip on Nima's wrist. I said, "Let her go." Tommy hesitated, the rage in his face warring with something else. Fear. He released Nima's wrist, shoving her hand away in disgust. Nima rubbed her aching arm, her pulse roaring in her ears. She kept her gaze fixed on the tall man. "I'm clumsy," Nima said, her voice shaking slightly, though she tried desperately to keep it steady. "I should get you a fresh cup. That one was compromised." Dom tilted his head a fraction of an inch. "Compromised?" "Yes," Nima said, swallowing hard. She didn't break eye contact. "I saw a rat in the kitchen earlier. It must have knocked something into the mugs while they were on the counter. Dust. Or a powder. It's an old building. Things fall into drinks when people aren't looking." The diner went dead silent. Tommy froze. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pale gray. He looked down at the shattered mug on the floor, at the small puddle of coffee soaking into the grout. At the edges of the puddle, a faint, chalky white residue clung to the tile, the undissolved remnants of whatever he had poured. Dom slowly shifted his gaze from Nima to the floor. He looked at the white residue for a long, quiet moment. Then he looked up at Tommy. "A rat," Dom repeated softly. "Dom, listen." Tommy started, his voice suddenly pitching an octave higher. His hands were trembling completely, forgetting the burns on his skin. "I don't know what this crazy bitch is talking about. She tripped. She's just trying to cover her own ass. Sit down, Tommy," Dom commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an executioner's gavel. Tommy collapsed into the booth as if his legs had given out. He pressed his back against the vinyl, sweating profusely. Dom reached into his coat pocket. Nima flinched, bracing for the flash of a gun. Instead, Dom pulled out a thick silver money clip. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill and laid it on the dry side of the table. He looked back at Nima. The assessment in his eyes had changed. It was no longer empty. It was piercing, analyzing every micro-expression on her tired face. He noted her cheap uniform, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hand trembled as she rubbed her bruised wrist. "Keep the change," Dom said quietly. "For your trouble." He stood up. He didn't look at Tommy. "Get up. We're leaving." Tommy scrambled out of the booth, terrified, shooting a look of pure, venomous hatred at Nima before stumbling after his boss. Nima stood frozen, watching them walk out into the sleet. The heavy glass door swung shut, muffling the sound of the street. She watched them get into a sleek, dark sedan parked at the curb. The engine roared to life, and the car pulled away, disappearing into the wet, black night. Nima was alone again. She let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a lifetime. Her knees suddenly felt weak, and she leaned heavily against the counter, sliding down until she was sitting on the sticky floor amidst the shattered ceramic and spilled coffee. She grabbed a handful of paper towels and began to wipe up the mess, her hands shaking violently. She had survived the night. But as she scrubbed at the white residue on the floor, a cold dread settled deep in her stomach. Men like that didn't just forget. She had interfered in a mob hit. She had exposed a traitor. She wasn't invisible anymore. Morning arrived with the shrill, unapologetic screaming of garbage truck brakes outside Nima's window. She hadn't slept. She had spent the last 5 hours lying on her lumpy mattress, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, waiting for the sound of boots in the hallway, or the splintering crash of her door being kicked in. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren had sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through her exhausted veins. By 9 o'clock, the fatigue won out over the panic. She dragged herself out of bed. Her apartment was a tiny, stifling box on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in a neighborhood that the city had long ago forgotten. Peeling floral wallpaper, a radiator that clanged like a dying engine, and a window that overlooked a narrow, trash-filled alley. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She paid for it with blisters and backaches. She walked into the cramped bathroom and splashed freezing water on her face. In the mirror, she looked like a ghost. Pale, hollow-eyed, with a distinct finger-shaped bruise blossoming a deep, ugly purple around her right wrist. She touched the bruise, gently wincing. A brutal reminder that last night wasn't a sleep-deprived hallucination. She needed to get out. She couldn't sit in the apartment anymore. The walls were closing in. She needed to buy groceries, do laundry, pretend that today was a normal Wednesday. Routine was the only anchor she had left. Nima pulled on a pair of faded jeans and a thick, oversized wool sweater to hide the bruise. She grabbed her canvas tote bag, locked the 3 deadbolts on her door, and began the long descent down the narrow, dimly lit stairwell. She pushed open the heavy front door of her building and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The cold morning air hit her, but she didn't shiver. She froze completely. Parked illegally in front of her building, taking up a fire lane, and gleaming beneath the harsh morning sun, was a car that belonged in a different universe. It was a massive, pristine black Mercedes Maybach. Its tinted windows were impenetrable, its polished chrome catching the light like a weapon. In this neighborhood where rusty sedans with shattered windows were the norm, the Maybach looked like an alien spaceship that had touched down in a landfill. A group of neighborhood kids had stopped playing on the corner, staring at the vehicle in hushed, intimidated awe. Standing by the rear passenger door was a man. He wasn't Dom, and he wasn't Tommy. He was built like a cinder-block wall, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that strained across his broad shoulders. He had a thick neck, closely cropped hair, and the calm, relaxed posture of a man who broke bones for a living. Nima's stomach plummeted. Her instinct screamed at her to turn around to run back up the stairs and barricade the door. But where would she go? You couldn't hide from people who drove cars like that. As if sensing her presence, the man turned his head. He looked straight at Nima. He didn't advance, but he didn't have to. The gravitational pull of the situation was already dragging her forward. He reached out and opened the heavy rear door of the Maybach, stepping back to leave the entrance clear. He looked at her, offering a polite, almost deferential nod. "Miss Reyes," the man said. His voice was remarkably smooth, a stark contrast to his brutal appearance. "Mr. Vasquez would like a word." Nima swallowed the dry lump in her throat. Mr. Vasquez. Dom. Now he had a name. "I have errands to run," Nima managed to say, clutching the straps of her canvas bag so hard her knuckles turned white. It was a pathetic, useless defense. The man offered a small, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The groceries can wait, Mom. Please, it's warm inside." It wasn't a request. The open door was a black hole, and she was already past the event horizon. Nima walked slowly toward the curb. Every step felt like walking to the gallows. She reached the car and looked inside. The interior was cavernous, lined with cream-colored leather-polished wood and soft ambient lighting. It smelled of expensive cologne, clean leather, and raw power. Sitting in the far seat, swallowed by the shadows of the tinted windows, was Dom. He was wearing a fresh suit, slate grey this time, and holding a crystal tumbler with an inch of amber liquid in it. He looked completely at ease, yet the tension radiating from him commanded the space. He looked at her, his dark eyes trailing down to the oversized sleeve of her sweater, right where he knew the bruise was hidden. "Get in, Nima," he said softly. She climbed into the back seat. The door shut behind her with a heavy vacuum-sealed thud, instantly cutting off the noise of the street. The screaming children, the traffic, the wind, it all vanished, replaced by the suffocating silence of luxury. The driver got in the front, and the engine purred to life, a deep, silent vibration. "I didn't tell anyone," Nima blurted out before the car even moved, panic finally overriding her survival instincts. "I don't know who you are. I don't care who you are. I didn't want you to drink it. That's all. We're even." Dom took a slow sip from his tumbler. He didn't look angry. He looked observant, analyzing her outburst with the clinical detachment of a predator watching a trapped bird flutter against the cage bars. "Tommy Romano was my right hand for 10 years. Dom said, his voice, a low, smooth baritone that vibrated in the quiet cabin. "He baptized my nephew. He ate dinner at my mother's table." Nima pressed herself against the door, trying to put as much distance between them as possible. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Dom replied, setting the crystal glass into a holder. He turned his head, finally locking his intense gaze fully onto hers. "Tommy was a rat. He sold me out to a rival family. The powder in that coffee was ricin. If I had taken a single sip, my organs would have shut down before I made it to my front door." Nima felt the blood drain from her face. Ricin. Not just a sleeping pill. Not a warning. A brutal, agonizing death. "You saved my life, Nima Reyes," Dom said softly, leaning slightly forward. The scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something smoky washed over her. "In my world, a debt of blood is the heaviest currency there is, and I don't like being in debt." "You don't owe me anything," Nima whispered fiercely. The tip was enough. Dom let out a short, breathy chuckle that held absolutely no humor. He reached into his jacket pocket. Nima flinched, but he only pulled out a slim, black leather folder. He tossed it onto the empty space of the seat between them. "Open it," he commanded quietly. Nima hesitated, her bruised wrist throbbing as she reached out. She flipped the folder open. Inside was a thick stack of crisp-banded $100 bills and a set of heavy brass keys attached to a leather fob. $50,000, and the keys to a newly renovated apartment in the Gold Coast district. Rent paid for the next 5 years. Dom stated, watching her reaction closely. Nima stared at the money. It was more cash than she had ever seen in her life. It was freedom. It was safety. It was a way out of the grinding poverty that was slowly crushing her to death. She looked up at Dom, her cynical, hardened heart beating wildly. She knew better. She knew the way the world worked. Nobody handed you a new life without attaching chains to it. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Dom's eyes darkened, a flash of genuine respect flickering in their depths. He leaned back in his seat as the Maybach merged smoothly into city traffic, taking her further and further away from the only world she knew. "The catch, Nima," Dom said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate murmur, "is that you are now under my protection, whether you want to be or not, and my enemies, they know exactly who spilled that coffee." Heavy rain battered the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse. Nima stood barefoot on heated hardwood, holding a mug of chamomile tea she didn't want. Below her, the city spread out like a glittering wet circuit board. It was a view she had only ever seen in lifestyle magazines left behind by diner patrons. Now it was her living room. $50,000 sat in a shoebox under the platform bed. She hadn't spent a dime. She felt like a zoo animal. A very expensive, very well-fed zoo animal. The apartment smelled of fresh paint and ozone, completely devoid of the familiar scent of stale cooking grease and radiator mold she was used to. The kitchen was a chef's dream she didn't know how to use, with cold, unyielding marble countertops. In her old apartment she fell asleep to sirens, domestic disputes, and the rumble of the subway. Here the silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It made her nauseous. Leo, the cinderblock man from the Maybach, sat in the hallway outside her front door. He worked 12-hour shifts. A second man, a wiry, silent guy named Paulie, took the nights. They didn't speak to her unless necessary. They just watched. The intercom buzzed a sharp electronic chirp that made her spill a drop of hot tea on her thumb. "Mr. Vasquez is coming up." Leo's voice crackled through the speaker. Nima tightened the belt of her oversized cardigan, wiping her thumb on the wool. She hadn't seen Dom in 2 days, not since he dropped her off with a curt nod and a promise that she was safe. Safe was a highly subjective term. The heavy oak door swung open. Dom walked in, bringing the cold dampness of the elevator shaft with him. He wore a black cashmere turtleneck and a tailored charcoal suit that looked less like clothing and more like armor. He looked exhausted. Dark smudges bruised the delicate skin under his eyes, and the harsh lines around his mouth were cut deeper than before. He moved with a predatory grace, but it seemed restrained today, weighed down by unseen pressures. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked straight to the expensive leather sofa and sat down, letting out a long, slow breath. "Nice place," Nima said, her voice dry, laced with the bitter cynicism that had kept her alive on the streets. She remained by the window, putting 12 feet of prime real estate between them. "Needs more bars on the windows?" Dom glanced at her. A faint, humorless smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're restless. I'm unemployed. I'm bored. And I have a bodyguard who eats tuna sandwiches outside my bedroom at 3 in the morning. Yes, I'm restless. Dom leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He laced his fingers together. The faint amusement vanished from his face, replaced by that terrifying, empty assessment she remembered from the diner. Tommy didn't act alone. Dom stated flatly. He didn't have the brains to procure weaponized ricin, and he certainly didn't have the stomach to initiate a war on his own. He was bought. By who? The Bianchi family. Dom replied. They operate out of the south side. They've been trying to push into my territory for 3 years. Killing me in a dingy diner on a Tuesday night would have created a power vacuum they could exploit. Nima crossed her arms, rubbing her shoulders against a chill that wasn't physical. And what does this have to do with me sitting in a luxury prison? Tommy made a phone call right after we left the diner. Dom explained quietly. Before my men got to him, he told his handler that the hit failed. He told them a waitress deliberately spilled the coffee. He blamed you. Cold fear spiked in Nima's chest. She gripped the ceramic mug tighter, her knuckles turning white. He blamed me. He was a coward. He needed an excuse for failing. He painted a target on your back to save his own skin. It didn't work. He's dead. Dom delivered the news of a brutal murder with the same casual tone someone might use to complain about the traffic. It was chilling. Nima swallowed hard, forcing her vocal cords to work. So the Bianchis want me dead for ruining their plan. They want you for leverage or for revenge. Either way, you are a loose end. And in my business, loose ends get clipped. Dom stood up, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped exactly 2 feet away. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his dark, intense eyes. I put you in this apartment because it has a private elevator, reinforced steel doors, and security cameras covering every blind spot. Dom said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre that vibrated against her skin. I didn't bring you here to lock you away, Nima. I brought you here to keep you breathing. I don't belong here, she whispered fiercely. Dom reached out. He didn't touch her face. He gently brushed a stray lock of hair off her shoulder, his knuckles barely grazing the wool of her sweater. The contact was brief, yet it sent a sharp electric jolt straight down her spine. Nobody belongs anywhere, Dom said, stepping back. We just survive where we land. Get some sleep. Tomorrow you can leave the apartment, but Leo goes with you. He turned and walked out, leaving the rich scent of sandalwood and danger lingering heavily in the sterile air. 3 days of pacing the immaculate hardwood floors finally broke her. Nima couldn't handle the oppressive perfection of the penthouse anymore. She needed noise. She needed the chaotic, filthy, unpredictable energy of the city. She dressed in her usual worn jeans, practical boots, and a plain black pea coat grabbing her canvas tote. When she opened the front door, Leo was there, standing like a monolith in a dark suit. I'm going to the grocery store, Nima announced, bracing for an argument, her chin tilting up defensively. Leo simply nodded, tapping a small earpiece hidden in his right ear. I'll drive. They took the Maybach. It felt utterly absurd taking a $500,000 flagship vehicle to buy cheap coffee and bruised apples, but Nima didn't have the energy to argue. She sat in the cavernous back seat, watching the grey city blur past the tinted glass. The grocery store was a massive, bright chain market in a wealthy neighborhood several miles away from her old life. It felt alien to her. The produce was perfectly stacked in geometric pyramids, the floors gleamed, and the shoppers moved with leisurely, unbothered grace. Nima used to calculate the cost per ounce of generic rice. Now she was surrounded by organic, air-chilled poultry and imported truffles. It made her feel like a fraud. Leo walked exactly 3 paces behind her. He didn't look at the shelves. He looked at hands, at waistbands, at the reflections in the dairy case glass. Nima tried to ignore him. She tossed a bag of dark roast beans into her basket, moving toward the bakery aisle. The smell of fresh yeast and sugar was momentarily comforting. She reached for a loaf of sourdough. Another hand reached for it at the exact same time. "Oh, excuse me," a man said, pulling his hand back with a charming, apologetic smile. He was in his late 30s, wearing a tan trench coat and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like an accountant. Ordinary. Harmless. "Go ahead," Nima muttered, stepping back and pulling her collar up. "You sure I'm in no rush?" The man said. He didn't take the bread. Instead, he looked at her. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they didn't match the warmth of his smile. They were entirely too still, tracking her face with predatory calculation. "You look familiar. Do you work over on the East Side Frank's Diner, right?" Nima froze. The ambient noise of the grocery store, the hum of the massive refrigerators, the terrible pop music on the overhead speakers, the squeak of cartwheels seemed to mute instantly. She hadn't been to Frank's in a week, and absolutely nobody who shopped in this zip code ate at Frank's. No. Nima lied smoothly, her heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Survival instinct kicked in, turning her face into a blank mask. "You have the wrong person." She turned to walk away, abandoning the bread and her basket. The man stepped sideways, fluidly blocking her path. The charming smile vanished, replaced by a cold, flat line. "I don't think so. You match the description perfectly. Clumsy girl. Spilled some hot coffee on a mutual friend of ours." Nima opened her mouth to scream, but before she could make a sound, a massive, bruising hand clamped onto the man's shoulder. Leo had materialized out of thin air. His thick fingers dug deep into the fabric of the trench coat, pulling the man backward with terrifying, effortless strength. "The lady said you have the wrong person." Leo rumbled a deep vibration of pure menace. The man in the trench coat tensed his right hand, twitching rapidly towards the inner pocket of his coat. It was a micro-movement barely noticeable to a civilian, but Leo caught it instantly. In a blur of sudden localized violence, Leo drove his knee brutally into the side of the man's thigh. The man gasped in shock, his leg buckling inward. Before he could fall, Leo slammed him face first into the metal shelving of the bread aisle. Loaves of brioche, rye, and sourdough tumbled to the floor in a shower of plastic and crumbs. Leo leaned his heavy weight in pressing his forearm against the back of the man's neck, pinning him flush against the steel rack. "Keep your hands exactly where I can see them." Leo whispered, his voice completely devoid of emotion. A few affluent shoppers at the end of the aisle gasped, abandoning their imported cheeses and hurrying away, pulling their children close. Leo looked over his broad shoulder at Nima. "Walk to the car, Miss Reyes. Do not run. Just walk. Now." Nima didn't hesitate. She speed-walked toward the sliding glass exit doors, her legs feeling like lead. Her hands shook, violently shoved deep into her coat pockets. She kept her head down, expecting a gunshot to ring out at any second, tearing through the glass and hitting her in the back. She reached the Maybach. The heavy doors unlocked automatically as she approached. She threw herself into the back seat, gasping for air, pressing her back deep into the plush leather hiding in the shadows. 2 agonizing minutes later, Leo slid into the driver's seat. He adjusted his tie and checked the rearview mirror. He wasn't breathing hard. There was a tiny, brilliant speck of blood on the pristine white collar of his shirt. "Is he—" Nima choked out, unable to finish the sentence. "He's taking a nap," Leo said calmly, shifting the massive car into drive. "Local police will pick him up in 3 minutes. They're on our payroll. Mr. Vasquez has been notified." Nima stared at the back of Leo's head as the car pulled smoothly out of the parking lot, merging back into traffic. The adrenaline crash hit her hard, leaving her nauseous and trembling. The reality of her situation hit her with the brutal force of a physical blow. Dom hadn't been paranoid. He hadn't been trying to control her for his own amusement. The man in the grocery store was a scout, a hunter, and they had found her with terrifying ease. She wasn't just a tired waitress who got caught in the crossfire anymore. She was an active piece on a very violent, very bloody chessboard. She looked down at her shaking hands, realizing with a sickening drop in her stomach that the only thing keeping her alive was a Mafia boss she barely knew, and the absolute worst part was she was starting to trust him. Panic is a cold, vibrating hum. Nima felt it trapped beneath her skin for hours after the grocery store, a relentless low-grade tremor she couldn't shake. She sat on the edge of the platform bed in her coat, her boots tracking faint smudges of wet pavement onto the pristine white rug. She didn't care. The sterile perfection of the penthouse was a lie. The man in the bread aisle had shattered the glass walls of her sanctuary with a single sentence. Leo had locked down the apartment. He stood by the reinforced front door, a silent, unmoving sentinel. He hadn't said a word since they returned. He didn't need to. The grim set of his jaw communicated everything Nima needed to know. They were waiting. At exactly 4 in the afternoon, the private elevator chimed. Dom bypassed the intercom entirely. He walked into the apartment with a controlled, terrifying velocity. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up to expose corded forearms, and a faint silver scar snaking across his left wrist. He didn't look at Leo. He bypassed the living room entirely and headed straight for the master bedroom. Nima stood up as he filled the doorway. He stopped scanning her from head to toe. His eyes were entirely black in the dim lighting of the bedroom, devoid of the calm calculation he usually carried. This was the man who ordered executions. This was the man who ruled an underground empire through sheer uncompromising will. "Are you hurt?" Dom asked. His voice was a harsh, gravelly scrape. "No," Nima managed to say. Her throat felt tight. "Leo handled it. I know exactly what Leo did." Dom stepped further into the room. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a rare gesture of agitated frustration. The man he neutralized was a low-level earner for the Bianchis, a nobody, which means they sent a nobody just to see if they could find you, to see how tight the security was. They found me in 3 days. Nima pointed out her cynicism, acting as a shield against her rising terror. "Your security sucks." Dom didn't blink. He didn't rise to the bait. He just stared at her, absorbing her defiance, understanding exactly where it came from. "They didn't break my security, Nima. They tracked the Maybach. It's a high-profile vehicle. I made a miscalculation allowing Leo to take it to a public commercial center. I underestimated their desperation. It was a staggering admission. Men like Darren Vasquez didn't admit fault. They deflected. They buried their mistakes. Hearing him own the error stripped away a layer of his untouchable facade, leaving something raw and dangerous underneath. "So what now?" Nima asked, wrapping her arms around her waist. "Do I get a different car, a disguise, maybe a fake mustache?" "You pack a bag," Dom commanded, turning away to look out the floor-to-ceiling window. The rain had intensified, blurring the city skyline into a smear of grey and yellow light. "We are leaving." Nima repeated, her pulse spiking. "The penthouse is compromised. They know the general vicinity. It's only a matter of time before they start bribing doormen or hacking the building's grid." Dom turned back to her, his jaw set. "I am moving you to a secure location outside the city limits, a place the Bianchis don't know exists." "For how long?" "Until the threat is eliminated." Nima let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. She dragged a hand down her face. "Eliminated. Right. You mean until you kill them? Or they kill you?" She looked up at him, her eyes burning with unshed, angry tears. "I was a waitress, Dom. I poured coffee and scraped dried ketchup off plates. Now I'm a hostage in a mob war. I didn't ask for this. You saved my life. Dom closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped right in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating off his body, smelling the sharp scent of ozone and adrenaline clinging to his shirt. You made a choice in that diner. Actions have consequences. This is yours. It's unfair. Fair is a concept invented by people who don't have to fight for their lives. Dom said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet intensity. He raised a hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before gripping her shoulder. His touch was firm, grounding. I will not let them touch you, Nima. You have my word, and my word is the only thing in this world that cannot be bought or broken. Pack your things. You have 10 minutes. He dropped his hand and walked out of the room. Nima stood frozen for a long moment, the ghost of his grip still burning through the thick wool of her coat. She didn't want to trust him. Trusting a man who lived by the gun was a guaranteed death sentence. But as she grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and began shoving clothes into it, she realized she had absolutely no other choice. Her survival was entirely tethered to a man who viewed her as a living debt. Midnight travel meant empty highways and swallowed secrets. Gravel crunched heavily beneath the tires of an unremarkable dark grey SUV. They had ditched the Maybach in a secure underground garage hours ago. Leo was driving. Dom sat in the passenger seat, a suppressed handgun resting casually on his thigh, his eyes scanning the pitch-black tree line passing by. Nima sat in the back, staring blankly out the window into the void. They had been driving for nearly 3 hours, leaving the harsh neon glow of the city behind for the dense, suffocating blackness of the deep woods. The road had turned from asphalt to dirt, winding through thick pines that completely blocked out the moon. The SUV slowed, turning sharply down a narrow, overgrown driveway. Headlights swept across an imposing iron gate. Leo punched a code into a keypad mounted on a wooden post. The heavy gates swung open with a rusty groan, admitting them into a clearing. Nestled against the edge of a steep drop-off was a massive, sprawling house. It was built of dark timber and river stone, blending perfectly into the surrounding forest. It didn't look like a mob safe house. It looked like a billionaire's secluded hunting lodge. No exterior lights were on. It sat completely dark, a shadow within shadows. Leo parked near a side entrance. Clear. He rumbled, stepping out into the freezing night air. Dom exited the vehicle, sliding his weapon into a shoulder holster with practiced ease. He opened Nima's door. Welcome to the edge of the world, he said, offering a hand to help her down from the high cab. Nima ignored his hand sliding out on her own. The air here was sharp, tasting of pine needles and damp earth. It was a massive contrast to the metallic, exhaust-choked air she breathed her entire life. It made her lungs ache. Inside the house was heavily winterized and smelled of cold ash and cedar. Dom bypassed a cavernous living room filled with shrouded furniture and walked straight into a massive industrial-style kitchen. He flipped a single switch, bathing the room in warm under-cabinet lighting. Leo will take the perimeter, Dom said, shrugging off his holster and laying it heavily onto the granite island. He opened a heavy stainless steel refrigerator. It was fully stocked. You want something to eat? I want my life back, Nima said, dropping her duffel bag onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. Dom paused, closing the refrigerator door slowly. He leaned against the counter, Vasquezing his arms over his chest. In the warm, dim light of the kitchen, the harsh, untouchable aura of the Mafia boss seemed to recede slightly. He just looked like a profoundly tired man. I can't give you that, Dom said quietly. The life you had died the second Tommy Romano dropped that powder into my cup. So I'm supposed to just stay here. Nima gestured around the massive silent house. Hide in the woods while you fight a war over a spilled cup of coffee. It's not about the coffee, Nima. It's about territory. The Bianchis used Tommy to make a play. Now they're using you to force my hand. Dom walked around the island, pulling out a wooden stool. He gestured for her to sit. Nima didn't move. She stood her ground, her chin tipped up. Why are you staying here? Don't you have a city to run, goons to command? Dom let out a slow, heavy breath. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a silver lighter. He flipped it open and shut the metallic clink echoing sharply in the quiet kitchen. My capos can handle the street-level retaliation. The Bianchis want a reaction. They want me to act recklessly, to expose myself by tearing the city apart, looking for the men who scared you. And by hiding out here. By staying here, I go off the board. Dom explained, his eyes locking onto hers. I become a ghost. They can't fight an enemy they can't find. It starves them of intel. It makes them paranoid. And paranoid men make fatal mistakes. Nima slowly crossed the room and sank onto the wooden stool. The exhaustion of the day finally crashed down on her, settling deep into her bones. She looked at Dom, really looked at him. Strip away the tailored clothes, the expensive cars, the bodyguards, and he was just a man surviving in a brutal ecosystem. You're using me as bait. Nima realized the words tasting like ash in her mouth. You moved me hoping they would follow so you could trap them. No. Dom's voice cracked like a whip in the quiet room. The silver lighter snapped shut in his hand, his knuckles turning white. He leaned over the counter, his face inches from hers. If I wanted to use you as bait, I would have left you in that apartment. I brought you here because this is the only place I can guarantee they will not find you. I am here because I am taking personal responsibility for your security. Nima stared into his dark eyes, searching for a lie, searching for the cynical angle. She found none. Just a hard, uncompromising truth. Why? Nima whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm nobody. I'm a waitress. You paid me off. The debt is settled. Dom reached out. This time he didn't pull back. He gently cupped the side of her face, his thumb grazing her cheekbone. His hands were calloused rough from years of violence, yet his touch was startlingly tender. In my world, nobody steps in front of a bullet for me. Dom murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before meeting her eyes again. They step behind me, or they run. You didn't run, Nima. You threw yourself into the fire to save a man you didn't even know. He dropped his hand, stepping back instantly, rebuilding the invisible wall between them. The moment was over, but the air in the kitchen felt permanently altered, thick, with an unspoken shift in gravity. Get some sleep, Dom said, turning toward the dark hallway. Your room is at the top of the stairs, first door on the right. I'll be down here. Nima watched him walk away, his broad shoulders carrying the invisible weight of an entire criminal syndicate. She picked up her duffel bag, her bruised wrist twinging in protest. She was trapped in a secluded lodge with a Mafia boss and an impending war outside their gates. Yet as she climbed the heavy wooden stairs into the darkness, a strange, undeniable truth settled over her. For the first time since that night at the diner, she actually felt safe. Isolation strips a person down to their absolute baseline. By the fourth day at the secure lodge, the adrenaline had completely burned out of Nima's system, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. The sprawling house with its vaulted ceilings and heavy timber beams felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully furnished purgatory. Outside, the winter storm raged on, burying the narrow driveway beneath 2 feet of snow and cutting them off entirely from the chaotic grid of the city. She learned the rigid, unforgiving architecture of Darren Vasquez's existence. He didn't relax. He merely conserved energy. He slept exactly 3 hours a night on the leather sofa in the downstairs study, his weapon resting on the coffee table within an inch of his fingertips. During the day, he managed a massive, violent enterprise through brief coded conversations on a satellite phone, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated through the floorboards. He didn't patronize her. He didn't apologize for the silence or the heavy, suffocating tension that hung in the air. They existed in a strange, suspended orbit around one another. On the fifth evening, the temperature plummeted, freezing the heavy snow into a solid sheet of ice. Nima stood by the kitchen island, watching the water boil for tea. The only sound in the massive house was the whistling of the wind against the reinforced glass. Dom walked into the kitchen. He had finally discarded the suit pants and button-down shirts, wearing a dark thermal Henley and heavy tactical trousers. He looked wilder here. The polished veneer of the city boss had cracked, revealing the apex predator underneath. He didn't speak. He walked past her, opening the heavy wooden door of a utility closet. He pulled out a sleek, matte black shotgun, checking the chamber with a sharp, mechanical clack that made Nima flinch. "What's wrong?" Nima asked, her voice tight. "The perimeter sensors went dead 3 minutes ago." Dom stated flatly, grabbing a handful of heavy red shells from a shelf and shoving them into his pockets. "Could be the ice. Could be a severed line. I don't believe in coincidences." Nima felt the familiar cold hum of panic vibrating beneath her skin. "I thought you said they couldn't find this place." "I said they didn't know it existed. That doesn't mean they couldn't buy someone who did." Dom walked back to the island, stopping directly in front of her. He reached out his large hands, gripping her shoulders, anchoring her in the rising tide of fear. "Listen to me very carefully. You do not run outside. You do not go near the windows. You go down into the wine cellar, you lock the steel grate, and you do not make a sound until I come for you. Do you understand?" Before Nima could answer, a concussive, deafening boom shattered the quiet of the night. It wasn't cinematic. It didn't sound like a firecracker. It was a localized earthquake that rattled the granite countertops and blew out the massive glass pane of the front living room window. The heavy wooden front door splintered inward, torn completely off its steel hinges by a breaching charge. Freezing air and the acrid, burning smell of cordite flooded the house instantly. "Move!" Dom roared, shoving Nima hard toward the hallway leading to the basement. He didn't seek cover. He stepped directly into the open archway of the kitchen, raising the shotgun. The weapon kicked violently in his hands, unleashing a deafening roar that made Nima's ears ring with a high, sharp whine. A man in the living room, clad entirely in white winter camouflage, was thrown backward through the shattered window, his chest caved in by the heavy buckshot. Nima scrambled on her hands and knees down the dark hallway. The house erupted into absolute chaos. Automatic gunfire ripped through the walls, shredding the drywall and sending clouds of plaster dust into the air. From the back of the house, Leo's heavy suppressed rifle returned fire in measured, controlled bursts. The violence was terrifyingly fast, devoid of any music or dramatic pauses. It was just noise destruction and the brutal reality of men trying to tear each other apart. She reached the top of the cellar stairs, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. She looked back over her shoulder. Dom was moving backward down the hall, providing covering fire. Another figure breached the kitchen window, leveling a submachine gun. Dom spun, firing the shotgun from the hip. The intruder dropped, but not before a short, erratic burst of bullets chewed through the wooden doorframe next to Dom. Dom grunted a sharp, choked sound. He staggered backward, his shoulder slamming hard against the wall. The shotgun slipped from his grip, clattering onto the hardwood floor. "Dom!" Nima screamed, her survival instinct completely overridden by a sudden, blinding panic. She didn't run down the stairs. She scrambled back down the hallway, grabbing the heavy wool rug beneath Dom's boots and pulling with all her remaining strength. Dom collapsed onto his knees, his left hand clutching his right side just below the ribs. Dark, thick crimson was already spreading rapidly across the dark fabric of his thermal shirt. He looked up at her, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock and absolute fury. "I told you to get in the cellar." He rasped, his voice tight with agony. "Shut up!" Nima snapped, grabbing his uninjured arm and wrapping it over her shoulder. "Get up. You have to get up. Using the wall for leverage, she hauled him to his feet. He was incredibly heavy, dead weight, dragging her down, but adrenaline gave her a brief, frantic surge of strength. Together they stumbled down the steep wooden stairs into the pitch-black, freezing air of the wine cellar. Nima shoved him into the corner behind a massive oak storage rack. She scrambled back to the steel grate door, slamming it shut and throwing the heavy iron bolt into place just as a shadow crossed the top of the stairs. She held her breath, pressing her back against the cold stone wall. Her hands were slick with Dom's blood. Above them, the gunfire abruptly ceased. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It was heavy, pregnant, filled with the terrifying sound of heavy boots walking slowly across the shattered hardwood floor directly above their heads. Nima slid down the wall until she was sitting next to Dom in the absolute darkness. She could hear his breathing, shallow, wet, and ragged. She reached out blindly, finding his hand in the dark. He gripped her fingers with crushing, desperate force. For 10 agonizing minutes they sat in silence, waiting for the cellar door to be blown open, waiting for the end. Then the heavy boots upstairs stopped. A voice echoed down the stairwell. It was a deep, familiar rumble. "House is clear, boss. I counted 6. They're all down." It was Leo. Nima let out a jagged, sobbing breath, resting her head against the freezing stone. They had survived. But as she felt the sticky, cooling blood coating her hands, she knew the war had finally crossed the threshold. The aftermath of violence is an incredibly sterile, mundane process. There are no sweeping scores or triumphant speeches. There is only the harsh glare of tactical flashlights, the sharp smell of bleach, and the metallic tang of copper in the air. Leo carried Dom up the stairs and laid him on the massive dining room table. The kitchen was unrecognizable, a jagged landscape of shattered glass, bullet-riddled wood, and freezing wind howling through the open window frames. Nima didn't panic. The hysterical fear had burned away, leaving a cold, clinical clarity in its wake. She had seen gunshot wounds before growing up in a neighborhood where sirens were a daily soundtrack. "Get the first aid kit from the SUV." Nima commanded Leo. Her voice didn't shake. "And boil some water. Lots of it." Leo didn't argue. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and gave a sharp nod before moving with terrifying speed. Dom lay on the heavy oak table, his teeth gritted in silent agony. He watched Nima as she grabbed a pair of heavy shears from the kitchen drawer and ruthlessly cut away his ruined shirt. "You should be in shock." Dom ground out his chest, heaving. His skin was pale, covered in a sheen of cold sweat, yet his eyes remained sharply focused on her face. "I don't have time for shock," Nima muttered, pressing a thick wad of clean dish towels against the ragged entry wound just below his ribs. "Hold this. Press hard." He weakly raised his hand, covering hers, pressing the makeshift bandage down. "It's a through and through." Dom rasped, his breathing hitching. "Missed the lung. Missed the liver. I got lucky." "You call this lucky?" Nima asked bitterly. Leo returned with a massive hard-shell medical kit. He moved efficiently, taking over the pressure while Nima dug through the supplies, finding antiseptic hemostatic gauze and thick trauma dressings. For the next hour, the sprawling dining room turned into a makeshift trauma bay. Nima worked with quiet, desperate precision, packing the wound and wrapping Dom's torso tightly to stop the bleeding. Leo stood guard by the shattered door, his rifle continually scanning the dark tree line, a silent statue of pure vigilance. By the time she finished, Nima's hands were shaking so violently she dropped the medical tape twice. She stepped back, leaning heavily against the counter, staring at the ruined kitchen. Dom was sitting up, slightly propped against a pile of untouched decorative pillows Leo had grabbed from the living room. His color was terrible, but his breathing had leveled out. He reached into his pocket with his good hand, pulling out his burner phone. He dialed a number from memory. "It's done," Dom said into the phone, his voice a hoarse whisper. They sent a hit squad to the lodge, 6 men, all dead. The Bianchis played their final card. Hit the main compound. Take the old man out. End it tonight. He dropped the phone onto the table. It was over. The retaliatory strike would wipe the rival family off the map before sunrise. The war he had been fighting for 3 years had just been won on a dining room table in the middle of a frozen forest. Dom looked at Nima. The harsh, untouchable aura of the Mafia boss was completely gone, stripped away by blood loss and pain. He was just a man. A dangerously capable, deeply flawed man. "Leo will take you to the airstrip in the morning," Dom said quietly. Nima froze a blood-soaked towel in her hand. "What? The debt is settled." Dom continued, his eyes locking onto hers. They were dark, unreadable pools. "You saved my life twice. I have a private jet waiting. It will take you to London. There's a bank account set up in your name. $5 million. A new passport, a new identity. You walk away from this, Nima. You never look over your shoulder again." Nima stared at him. It was everything she had ever dreamed of in the diner. Wealth, freedom, total safety. It was the ultimate escape hatch. She looked down at her hands permanently stained with the reality of his world. She thought about the sterile, lonely penthouse. She thought about the mundane, exhausting reality of serving coffee to dead-eyed commuters. She thought about the way Dom looked at her, when he thought she wasn't paying attention, a look that made her feel more seen, more alive than she had ever felt in her entire life. She walked slowly over to the table. She didn't look at the money or the phone or the ruined house. She looked directly into Dom's eyes. "I don't speak a word of British," Nima said dryly. Dom's brow furrowed slightly in confusion. "Nima, I am giving you an out. The normal world." "The normal world is a lie." Nima interrupted, her voice dropping to a fierce, quiet intensity. "It's a lie they sell to people to keep them quiet while they scrub floors and pay rent. I don't want the normal world anymore. I don't fit in it. Not after this." Dom stared at her, the mask completely slipping, revealing a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "If you stay, there is no going back. You belong to this life. You belong to me. I don't belong to anyone." Nima shot back, leaning in close, the scent of antiseptic and copper clinging to the space between them. She reached out, gently touching the uninjured side of his chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath her fingertips. "But I'm choosing to stay right here." Dom let out a slow, jagged breath. The tension that had defined his entire existence seemed to fracture, breaking apart into something infinitely more dangerous. He reached up, his rough, calloused hand gripping the back of her neck, pulling her down. When he kissed her, it wasn't a soft, romantic promise. It was desperate. It was a brand. It tasted of blood and adrenaline and survival, a brutal acknowledgement of the darkness they had both chosen to embrace. The wind howled through the shattered windows, dragging the freezing winter air into the ruined house. It didn't matter. The cold couldn't touch them anymore. Nima closed her eyes, sinking into the gravity of the man holding her, realizing with absolute cynical certainty that sometimes the only way to escape the darkness is to learn how to rule it. Thank you so much for watching. If Nima's quick thinking and Dom's dangerous world hooked you, make sure to hit that like button. Will Nima survive being tied to a mafia boss, or did she just trade one nightmare for a deadlier one? Drop a comment below with your predictions for Part 4. Don't forget to share this with your fellow romance drama fans, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update on this story.